Introduction. My subject is self-fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare. My starting point is quite simply that in 16th century England there were both selves and a sense that they could be fashioned. Of course, there is some absurdity in so bald a pronouncement of the obvious. After all, there are always selves, a sense of personal order, a characteristic mode of address to the world, a structure of bounded desires, and always some elements of deliberate shaping in the formation and expression of identity. One need only think of Chaucer's extraordinarily subtle and wry manipulations of persona to grasp that what I propose to examine does not suddenly spring up from nowhere when 1499 becomes 1500. Moreover, there is considerable empirical evidence that there may well have been less autonomy in self-fashioning in the 16th century than before. That family, state, and religious institutions impose a more rigid and far-reaching discipline upon their middle-class and aristocratic subjects. Autonomy is an issue, but not the sole or even the central issue. The power to impose a shape upon oneself is an aspect of the more general power to control identity, that of others at least as often as one's own. What is central is the perception, as old in academic writing as Burckhardt and Michelet, that there is in the early modern period a change in the intellectual, social, psychological, and aesthetic structures that govern the generation of identities. This change is difficult to characterize in our usual ways because it is not only complex, but resolutely dialectical. If we say that there is a new stress on the executive power of the will, we must say that there is the most sustained and relentless assault upon the will. If we say that there is a new social mobility, we must say that there is a new assertion of power, both by family and the state, to determine all movement within the society. If we say that there is a heightened awareness of the existence of alternative modes of social, theological, and psychological organization, we must say that there is a new dedication to the imposition of control upon those modes, and ultimately to the destruction of alternatives. Perhaps the simplest observation we can make is that in the 16th century there appears to be an increased self-consciousness about the fashioning of human identity as a manipulable, artful process. Such self-consciousness had been widespread among the elite in the classical world, but Christianity brought a growing suspicion of man's power to shape identity. Hands off yourself, Augustine declared. Try to build up yourself, and you build a ruin. This view was not the only one available in succeeding centuries, but it was influential, and a powerful alternative began to be fully articulated only in the early modern period. When in 1589 Spencer writes that the general intention and meaning that he has fashioned in the Fairy Queen is to fashion a gentleman, or when he has his knight Calidore declare that in each man's self it is to fashion his own life's estate, or when he tells his beloved in one of the Amoretti, "You frame my thoughts and fashion me within," he is drawing upon the special connotations for his period of the verb fashion, a word that does not occur at all in Chaucer's poetry. As a term for the action or process of making, for particular features or appearance, for a distinct style or pattern, the word had been long in use. But it is in the 16th century that fashion seems to come into wide currency as a way of designating the forming of a self. This forming may be understood quite literally as the imposition upon a person of physical form. Did not one fashion us in the womb? Job asks in the King James Bible, while, following the frequent injunctions to fashion children, midwives in the period attempted to mold the skulls of the newborn into the proper shape. But more significantly for our purposes, fashioning may suggest the achievement of a less tangible shape, a distinctive personality, a characteristic address to the world, a consistent mode of perceiving and behaving. As we might expect, the recurrent model for this latter fashioning is Christ. Those whom God in his foreknowledge has called, Tyndall translates the epistle to the Romans, he fashioned into the shape of his Son. And thus, the true Christian, Tyndall writes in The Obedience, feeleth himself altered and fashioned like unto Christ. We are exhorted, Archbishop Sandys remarks in a sermon, to fashion ourselves according to that similitude and likeness which is in him. While in the 1557 Geneva translation of the New Testament, we read that Christ was disfigured to fashion us. Wow, that's nice. Disfigured to fashion us. He died for our life. If Christ is the ultimate model, he is not even in the New Testament the only one. In all things, Paul tells the Corinthians in Tyndale's translation, I fashioned myself to all men, to save to the least way some. This principle of adaptation is obviously not limited to the propagation of the gospel. In Richard Taverner's Garden of Wisdom, for example, we are told that whoever desires to be conversant with public affairs must fashion himself to the manners of men. And this counsel is tirelessly reiterated. Thus separated from the imitation of Christ, a separation that can, as we shall see, give rise to considerable anxiety, self-fashioning acquires a new range of meanings. It describes the practice of parents and teachers. It is linked to manners or demeanor, particularly that of the elite. It may suggest hypocrisy or deception, an adherence to mere outward ceremony. It suggests representation of one's nature or intention in speech or actions. And with representation, we return to literature. Or rather, we may grasp that self-fashioning derives its interest precisely from the fact that it functions without regard for a sharp distinction between literature and social life. It invariably crosses the boundaries between the creation of literary characters, the shaping of one's own identity, the experience of being molded by forces outside one's control, the attempt to fashion other selves. Such boundaries may, to be sure, be strictly observed in criticism, just as we may distinguish between literary and behavioral styles. But in doing so, we pay a high price, for we begin to lose a sense of the complex interactions of meaning in a given culture. We wall off literary symbolism from the symbolic structures operative elsewhere, as if art alone were a human creation, as if humans themselves were not, in Clifford Geertz's phrase, cultural artifacts. There is no such thing as a human nature independent of culture, Geertz writes, meaning by culture not primarily complexes of concrete behavior patterns, customs, usages, traditions, habit clusters, but rather a set of control mechanisms, plans, recipes, rules, instructions for the governing of behavior. Self-fashioning is, in effect, the Renaissance version of these control mechanisms, the cultural system of meanings that creates specific individuals by governing the passage from abstract potential to concrete historical embodiment. Literature functions within this system in three interlocking ways. First, as a manifestation of the concrete behavior of its particular author. Second, as itself the expression of the codes by which behavior is shaped. And third, as a reflection upon those codes. The interpretive practice that I have attempted to exemplify in the essays that follow must concern itself with all three of these functions. If interpretation limits itself to, one, the behavior of the author, it becomes literary biography in either a conventionally historic or psychoanalytic mode, and risks losing a sense of the larger networks of meaning in which both the author and his works participate. If, alternatively, literature is viewed exclusively as the expression of social rules and instructions, it risks being absorbed entirely into an ideological superstructure. Marx himself vigorously resisted this functional absorption of art, and subsequent Marxist aesthetics, for all its power and sophistication, has never satisfactorily resolved the theoretical problems raised in the Grundrisse and elsewhere. Finally, if literature is seen only as, 3, a detached reflection upon the prevailing behavioral codes, a view from a safe distance, we drastically diminish our grasp of art's concrete functions in relation to individuals and to institutions, both of which shrink into an obligatory historical background that adds little to our understanding. We drift back toward a conception of art as addressed to a timeless, cultureless, universal human essence, or, alternatively as a self-regarding, autonomous, closed system. In either case, art as opposed to social life. He keeps saying social life too, and what he really means, what he only means is like life in its like literal embodied, socially driven and socially connected form. Self-fashioning then becomes a subject only for sociology, literature for literary criticism, if we do that third version, which he says we shouldn't do. Okay, back to Greenblatt. I have attempted instead to practice a more cultural or anthropological criticism. If by anthropological here we think of interpretive studies of culture by Geertz, James Boone, Mary Douglas, Jean Duvigneau, Paul Rabinow, Victor Turner, and others. These figures do not enlist themselves under a single banner, still less do they share a single scientific method, but they have in common the conviction that men are born unfinished animals, that the facts of life are less artless than they look, that both particular cultures and the observers of these cultures are inevitably drawn to a metaphorical grasp of reality, that anthropological interpretation must address itself less to the mechanics of customs and institutions than to the imperative constructions the members of society apply to their experiences. A literary criticism that has affinities to this practice must be conscious of its own status as interpretation and intent upon understanding literature as a part of the system of signs that constitutes a given culture. Its proper goal, however difficult to realize, is a poetics of culture. I'm going to reread that sentence because I feel like my inflection was inflection and the mechanics of the sentence were kind of askew. So I'm going to try again. That's because with my underlining, I hid the fact that one of the pieces of punctuation is a semicolon. I will do better. A literary criticism that has affinities to this practice must be conscious of its own status as interpretation and intent upon understanding literature as a part of the system of signs that constitutes a given culture. Its proper goal, however difficult to realize, is a poetics of culture. Such an approach is necessarily a balancing act, correcting each of the functional perspectives I sketched in the preceding paragraph against the others, and necessarily impure. Its central concerns prevent it from permanently sealing off one type of discourse from another, or decisively separating works of art from the minds and lives of their creators and their audiences. I remain concerned, to be sure, with the implications of artistic representation as a distinct human activity. Shakespeare's depiction of Othello, of his hero's self-construction and destruction, is not simply identical to those patterns of self-fashioning and self-cancellation that I explore in the careers of several of my authors. But the way to explore these implications lies neither in denying any relation between the play and social life, nor in affirming that the latter is the thing itself, free from interpretation. Social actions are themselves always embedded in systems of public signification, always grasped, even by their makers, in acts of interpretation, while the words that constitute the works of literature that we discuss here are, by their very nature, the manifest assurance of a similar embeddedness. Language, like other sign systems, is a collective construction. Our interpretive task must be to grasp more sensitively the consequences of this fact by investigating both the social presence to the world of the literary text and the social presence of the world in the literary text. I'm going to read that one again, too. Language, like other sign systems, is a collective construction. Our interpretive task must be to grasp more sensitively the consequences of this fact by investigating both the social presence to the world of the literary text and the social presence of the world in the literary text. The literary text remains the central object of my attention in this study of self-fashioning, in part because, as I hope these chapters will demonstrate, great art is an extraordinarily sensitive register of the complex struggles and harmonies of culture, and in part because, by inclination and training, whatever interpretive powers I possess are released by the resonances of literature. I should add that if cultural poetics is conscious of its status as interpretation, this consciousness must extend to an acceptance of the impossibility of fully reconstructing and re-entering the culture of the 16th century, of leaving behind one's own situation. It is everywhere evident in this book that the questions I ask of my material, and indeed the very nature of this material, are shaped by the questions I ask of myself. I do not shrink from these impurities. They are the price, and perhaps among the virtues of this approach. But I have tried to compensate for the indeterminacy and incompleteness they generate by constantly returning to particular lives and particular situations, to the material necessities and social pressures that men and women daily confronted, and to a small number of resonant texts. Each of these texts is viewed as the focal point for converging lines of force in 16th century literature. Their significance for us is not that we may see through them to underlying and prior historical principles, but rather that we may interpret the interplay of their symbolic structures with those perceivable in the careers of their authors and in the larger social world as constituting a single, complex process of self-fashioning, and through this interpretation, come closer to understanding how literary and social identities were formed in this culture. That is, we are able to achieve a concrete apprehension of the consequences for human expression, for the I, of a specific form of power. Power at once localized in particular institutions, the court, the church, the colonial administration, the patriarchal family, and diffused in ideological structures of meaning, characteristic modes of expression, recurrent narrative patterns. Inevitably, the resonance and centrality we find in our small group of texts and their authors is our invention, and the similar cumulative inventions of others. It is we who enlist them in a kind of historical drama. And we need such a drama in part because compulsive readers of literature tend to see the world through literary models, and in part because our own lives, quite apart from professional deformation, are saturated with experience artfully shaped. If we constantly use devices of selection and shaping in accounting for our lives, if we insist upon the importance of certain turning points and crises, or, in Freud's famous modern instance, seize upon the plot of a Sophoclean tragedy to characterize our shared family romance, then it is not surprising that we engage in a similar narrative selection when we reflect upon our shared historical origins. In attempting to glimpse the formation of identity in the English Renaissance, we cannot rest content with statistical tables, nor... I can't look up from this at all, or I lose my spots. We cannot rest content with statistical tables, nor are we patient enough to tell over 1,000 stories, each with its slight variance. The problem is not only a lack of patience, but a sense of hopelessness. After 1,000, there would be another 1,000, then another, and it is not at all clear that we would be closer to the understanding we seek. So, from the thousands, we seize upon a handful of arresting figures who seem to contain within themselves much of what we need, who both reward intense individual attention and promise access to larger cultural patterns. That they do so is not, I think, entirely our own critical invention. Such, at least, is one of the enabling presumptions of this book. We respond to a quality, even a willed or partially willed quality, in the figures themselves, who are, we assume by analogy to ourselves, engaged in their own acts of selection and shaping, and who seem to drive themselves toward the most sensitive regions of their culture, to express, and even by design to embody, its dominant satisfactions and anxieties. Among artists, the will to be the culture's voice, to create the abstract and brief chronicles of the time, is a commonplace, but the same will may extend beyond art. Or rather, for the early 16th century, art does not pretend to autonomy. The written word is self-consciously embedded in specific communities, life situations, structures of power. We do not have direct access to these figures or their shared culture, but the operative condition of all human understanding, of the speech of our contemporaries as well as of the writings of the dead, is that we have indirect access to, or is that we have indirect access, or at least that we experience our constructions. One more time. We do not have direct access to these figures or their shared culture. But the operative condition of all human understanding, of the speech of our contemporaries as well as of the writings of the dead, is that we have indirect access, or at least that we experience our constructions as the lived equivalent of such access. We should note in the circumstances of the 16th century figures on whom this study focuses a common factor that may help to explain their sensitivity as writers to the construction of identity. They all embody in one form or another a profound mobility. In most cases, this mobility is social and economic. Moore, the son of a reasonably successful London lawyer, becomes a knight, Speaker of the House of Commons, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Steward of Cambridge University, and finally Lord Chancellor of England, the confidant of Henry VIII. Spencer, the son of a modest free journeyman of the Merchant Tailors Company, becomes a substantial colonial landowner described in royal documents as a gentleman dwelling in the county of Cork. Marlowe, the son of a shoemaker and parish clerk of St. Mary's, Canterbury, receives degrees from Cambridge University. A more modest ascent, to be sure, but an ascent nonetheless. Shakespeare, the son of a prosperous glover, is able by the close of his career to acquire on his father's behalf a coat of arms and to buy the second largest house in Stratford. All of these talented middle-class men moved out of a narrowly circumscribed social sphere and into a realm that brought them in close contact with the powerful and the great. All were in a position as well, we should add, to know with some intimacy those with no power, status, or education at all. With Tyndall, we have to do not with upward mobility in the conventional sociological sense, but rather with a highly charged geographical and ideological mobility. A passage from Catholic priest to Protestant, from the Gloucestershire of his successful yeoman farmer family to London, and then to continental exile, from obscurity to the dangerous fame of a leading heretic. Finally, with Wyatt, whose family had risen in status and wealth only in the preceding generation, we have the restless mobility, France, Italy, Spain, Flanders, of the diplomat. The 6 writers I consider here, then, are all displaced in significant ways from a stable, inherited social world, and they all manifest in powerful and influential form aspects of Renaissance self-fashioning. But the aspects are by no means the same. Indeed, my organization in this book depends upon the perception of 2 radical antitheses, each of which gives way to a complex third term in which the opposition is reiterated and transformed. The conflict between Moore and Tyndall is reconceived in the figure of Wyatt, that between Spencer and Marlowe in the figure of Shakespeare. Wyatt does not raise the opposition of Moore and Tyndall to a higher level, though his self-fashioning is profoundly affected by the consequences of that opposition. Shakespeare does not resolve the aesthetic and moral conflict inherent in the works of Spencer and Marlowe, though his theater is enigmatically engaged in both positions. Rather, Wyatt and Shakespeare express in literary works, more powerful than any produced by their contemporaries, the historical pressure of an unresolved and continuing conflict. Moreover, the issues raised by at the theological level in the works of Moore and Tyndall are recapitulated at the secular level in the works of Spencer and Marlowe. While Shakespeare explores in Othello and elsewhere the male sexual anxieties, the fear of betrayal, the suspension and release of aggression, the intimations of complicity in one's own torment, voiced in Wyatt's lyrics. We may posit a direction enacted by these figures in relation to power. For the first triad, a shift from the church to the book to the absolutist state. For the second triad, a shift from celebration to rebellion to subversive submission. Similarly, we may posit a direction enacted by the works of literature in relation to society. A shift from absorption by community, religious faith, or diplomacy toward the establishment of literary creation as a profession in its own right. But we must recognize that such approximate and schematic chartings are of limited value. The closer we approach the figures in their works, the less they appear as convenient counters in a grand historical scheme. A series of shifting, unstable pressures is met with a wide range of discursive and behavioral responses, inventions, and counter-pressures. There is no such thing as a single history of the self in the 16th century, except as a product of our need to reduce the intricacies of complex and creative beings to safe and controllable order. This book will not advance any comprehensive explanation of Renaissance self-fashioning. Each of the chapters is intended to stand alone as an exploration whose contours are shaped by our grasp of the specific situation of the author or text. We may, however, conclude by noting a set of governing conditions common to most instances of self-fashioning, whether of the authors themselves or of their characters, examined here. 1. None of the figures inherits a title, an ancient family tradition, or hierarchical status that may have rooted personal identity in the identity of a clan or caste. With the partial exception of Wyatt, all these writers are middle class. 2. Self-fashioning for such figures involves submission to an absolute power or authority, situated at least partially outside the self. God, a sacred book, an institution such as church, court, colonial, or military administration. Marlowe is an exception, but his consuming hostility to hierarchical authority has, as we shall see, some of the force of submission. 3. Self-fashioning is achieved in relation to something perceived as alien, strange, or hostile. This threatening other, heretic, savage, witch, adulteress, traitor, antichrist, must be discovered or invented in order to be attacked and destroyed. The alien is perceived by the authority either as that which is unformed or chaotic, the absence of order, or that which is false or negative, the demonic parody of order. Since accounts of the former tend inevitably to organize and thematize it, the chaotic constantly slides into the demonic, and consequently, the alien is always constructed as a distorted image of the authority. 5. One man's authority is another man's alien. 6. When one authority or alien is destroyed, another takes its place. 7. There is always more than one authority and more than one alien in existence at a given time. 8. If both the authority and the alien are located outside the self, they are at the same time experienced as inward necessities, so that both submission and destruction are always already internalized. 9. Self-fashioning is always, though not exclusively, in language. 10. The power generated to attack the alien in the name of the authority is produced in excess and threatens the authority it sets out to defend. Hence, self-fashioning, it always involves some experience of threat, some effacement or undermining, some loss of self. To sum up these observations, before we turn to the rich lives and texts that exemplify and complicate them, we may say that self-fashioning occurs at the point of encounter between an authority and an alien, that what is produced in this encounter partakes of both the authority and the alien that is marked for attack, and hence that any achieved identity always contains within itself the signs of its own subversion or loss.